morning, everybody. I've been given the privilege of introducing the next keynote speaker, Dr. Antoine Bousquet. Antoine is Reader in International Relations at Birkbeck College, University of London, and I know that many in here are already familiar with Antoine's work. You've read it, engaged with it, quoted it for a long time, and so have I. Antoine has a long experience in researching and teaching war. I think we can say that his work straddles the history and philosophy of science and technology and social and political theory. And he's the author of a number of articles in international journals, book chapters on topics such as Cold War computing, jihadist networks, complexity theory, and the revolution in military affairs. Antoine has also written two absolutely fantastic books on war. The widely read and cited book, The Scientific Way of Warfare, Order and Chaos on the Battlefields of Modernity, which deals with the influence of major scientific paradigms on the conduct of war in the modern era. Excuse me. And last year, his book, I think last fall, right? Mm-hmm. His book, The Eye of War, Military Perception from the Telescope to the Drone, was released on University of Minnesota Press. And in this book, Antoine traces how the history of the rationalization of vision and the mathematization of space during the Renaissance and onward have enabled fields of military perception. And also how it has enabled an ever-expanding martial gaze. So if you haven't read these books, I really recommend that you do. I think today's presentation is going to be on intelligence and the METIS system, perhaps. With that, I would like to hand over to you, Antoine.
Thank you, Dan. Can everyone hear me? Is the mic on? Yeah. Okay, good. Thanks, Dan, for the generous introduction. Thank you to Karina and everyone organizing the conference for inviting me. And thanks to all of you for being here. What I wanted to do today is explore this notion of design, push it perhaps in ways that haven't been discussed, certainly at least in this conference, and notably its relationship with the understanding or the notion of cunning. We might start by looking at the short text by the philosopher Wilhelm Flusser, where he inquired about the meaning of the word design, looking at its etymology and its various connotations. Flusser points out that in English, the word design is both a noun and a verb. As a noun, it means, among other things, intention, plan, intent, aim, scheme, plot, motif, all of these being connected with cunning and deception. As a verb, to design means have meanings that include to concoct something, to simulate, to draft, to sketch, to fashion, to have designs on something. And therefore, Flusser wants to point out that design has long been associated with deception, cunning, secrecy, and manipulation. In sum, the designer is a cunning plotter laying his or her traps. And so what I want to do today is to ask you to reacquaint yourselves with the conspiratorial spirit of design and its particular role in war. So indeed, it does have a particular affinity with war. And in doing so, to think about the specific intelligences, specific forms of intelligence that are native to it. Marcel Détienne and Jean-Pierre Vernant, who are the most significant French writers to have extricated this notion of cunning intelligence from its Greek origins, tell us that there are many activities in which man must learn to manipulate hostile forces too powerful to be controlled directly, but which can be exploited despite themselves, without ever being confronted head-on, to implement the plan in mind by some unexpected, devious means. I mean, they list among those kinds of activities that fall under this rubric the art of the pilot steering his ship against winds and tides, the verbal ploys of the sophist, making the adversary's powerful argument recoil against him, the skill of the banker and the merchant who, like conjurers, make a great deal of money out of nothing, the knowing forethought of the politician whose flair enables him to assess the uncertain course of events in advance, the sleights of hand and trade secrets which gave craftsmen their control over material which is always more or less intractable to their designs, and finally, the stratagems used by the warrior, the success of whose attack hinges on surprise, trickery, or ambush. What Detienne and Vernon are referring to in the Greek tradition is the notion of metis. Now, metis is an ancient Greek word for cunning intelligence. There is no equivalent in our contemporary languages, whereas we've inherited other Greek words for forms of intelligence, such as episteme, techne, and so on. We don't have any equivalent of metis. Indeed, even within the Greek tradition, metis is a repressed form of intelligence that doesn't feature in most of the discussions from the classical authors such as Socrates or Plato and Aristotle. Metis is concerned with, above all, practical efficacy, the pursuit of success in a particular sphere of activity. It is situational, improvisational form of knowledge that navigates an inherently uncertain, shifting environment, turning available resources within to its own advantage. Now, in Greek mythology, metis actually refers to a particular deity, and a very significant one at that. Metis was a goddess in the golden age of the Titans that preceded the Olympians. And the Greek poet Hesiod from the 8th century before the Common Era describes her as wiser than all gods and mortals. When Zeus ascended to become king of the gods, this is the beginning of the Olympian era, he took Metis as his first wife. Soon after he did so, he was warned that Metis would beget a son that would be wiser and more powerful than him and might usurp him just in the same way as Zeus had usurped his own father. So what Zeus did is he swallowed Metis whole in order to appropriate her qualities and assure his enduring supremacy. Nonetheless, their union begat Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare. Athena actually being born out of Zeus's head, fully formed. And this is, in fact, a depiction of this scene where you see Athena coming out of Zeus's head, and it's thought that the figure under the throne is Metis. So Zeus absorbed Metis in order to ensure his supremacy, so that his cunning would be superior to any other deity that might try to usurp him. And they gave birth to Athena, who therefore is, as the goddess of wisdom and warfare, is also ultimately the child of cunning. So cunning in some ways comes first. Within the Greek tradition, and the Greek mythology, the embodiment of Metis, beyond Metis itself, is Odysseus, who is, as the text tells us, polymetis, of much cunning. And what singles out Odysseus throughout the narratives that are left to us from Homer and other mythological versions of it is his ability to adapt successfully to a constantly shifting situation, his capacity to understand and hence outwit his human and divine adversaries. A particular famous scene, of course, is Odysseus' outwitting of the powerful Cyclops that he successfully blinds, but also ultimately escapes through the stratagem of tying themselves to the underside of the Cyclops' sheep. Now blinded, he just pats the back of the sheep to ensure that these are the beings that are leaving, but indeed Odysseus and his fellows are escaping from beneath. These, of course, are just one of the feats of cunning that Odysseus displays. This is the book, really, to understand metis in the Greek tradition. Again, d'Étienne and Vernon, a book from the 1970s. And it's remarkable how little, in fact, has been produced of it, because, as I say, within Greek culture itself, metis was always treated with the degree of ambivalence, and in fact rather suppressed. But it can be discerned through the texts if you do the kind of rigorous work that d'Étienne and Vernon do. What metis is, d'Étienne and Vernon tell us, is a type of intelligence and thought, a way of knowing, a complex but very coherent body of mental attitudes and intellectual behavior which combine flair, wisdom, forethought, subtlety of mind, deception, resourcefulness, vigilance, opportunism, various skills, and experience. It is, in a sense, as much an attitude as any kind of formal set of principles. And again, it is a form of intelligence that is manifest in particular contexts, or at least particularly suited to contexts, ones which are transient, shifting, disconcerting, and ambiguous. Those in which other forms of intelligence are ill-suited, those that rely on precise measurement, on exact calculation, or on rigorous logic. Now, we find in the work of James C. Scott an interesting discussion of metis in its relationship to another form of knowledge, which is that of techne. Scott's book is from the mid-1990s, is concerned with, as the subtitle of Seeing Like a State indicates, with various schemes attempted to rearrange, reorganize societies from the top down through rationalist schemes, economic planning and the like, development programs, and finding different ways in which these have failed because they rely, in his view, on techne rather than on metis. So we find in Scott a clear opposition between techne and metis. And I know Philippe will probably have some objections to the presentation of techne that I'll give. And I think to some extent Scott is a little bit caricatural in his depiction of techne, but actually it's a very complicated field. When you start reading the classics, these discussions blend into one another. But nonetheless, I think the distinctions can be useful as a heuristic. The opposition that Scott wants to make is between metis as situated practical knowledge and techne as universal technical knowledge. So techne is the realm of craft, the application of technical knowledge. It is, Scott tells us, expressed precisely and comprehensively in the form of hard and fast rules, principles, and propositions. Whereas metis is really about rules of thumb. They're general heuristic principles, but ultimately they have to be creatively adapted. There's no simple rule book to follow. There's no principles that you can just reapply to every situation. You have to readapt them, apply them contextually to every situation. In fact, that is metis is ultimately that intelligence of knowing when and how to apply certain rules of thumb, which also may have to be broken if necessary. Again, another distinction here, of course, is between techne and its techne's universal pretense to knowledge versus a form of knowledge that is entirely contextual and particular. Metis is not interested in producing universal principles that will apply everywhere. It is constructed, abstracted from the environment, from the situation, for a particular end, for efficacy in a discrete context. A techne comes into being, Scott tells us, when many notions gained from experience, from many notions gained from experience, a universal judgment about a group of similar things arises. This is actually a quote from Aristotle. So universal judgment versus particular contextual judgment. Martha Nussbaum, who wrote also about this concept of techne, argues that a person who says, as many did in the 5th century, that practical reason should become a techne is likely to be demanding a systematization and unification of practice that will yield accounts and some sort of orderly grasp. He will want principles that can be taught and explanations of how desired results are produced. He will want to eliminate some of the chanciness from human social life. So this is not, of course, what Metis does. Metis, Scott tells us, resists simplification into deductive principles, which can be successfully transmitted through book learning, because the environments in which it is exercised are so complex and non-repeatable that formal procedures or rational decision-making are impossible to apply. So Metis is a form of intelligence that is adaptable, that starts from the environment, starts from the problem and from the particularity of the problem, rather than bring to a given problem a set of principles, a set of rules, a set of notions that have been produced elsewhere. So it is not, in a sense, an inductive form of reasoning, where induction involves starting from the particular in order to abstract universal examples. It is much more what we might call an abductive form of reasoning, where there's a constant back and forth between the empirical and our theoretical abstraction of it. So, as a consequence, activities involving Metis are typically difficult to teach apart from engaging in the activity itself. Some of the examples we might give would be learning to fish, or to ride a bike, or to surf a wave. And you can sit people in a classroom and tell them the theory until they fall asleep, but they won't be able to perform these actions meaningfully until they're on that wave, they're sitting on that bike, and they're trying to fish. Some of the things you will have taught them may be useful, but ultimately it's an embodied, practical form of knowledge that has to be internalized through practice. And many of these forms of knowledge are, in a sense, tacit, implicit. They can't be formalized. They have to be learned. They have to be deduced by every individual who practices them. So ultimately, Metis is a form of know-how that involves improvisation, adaptation to unpredictable events. The reason why why you have to learn how to surf a wave is because every single wave is unique. Every wave will have its own currents, its own speeds, its own ratios, intensities. That the very act of surfing is the ability to tame that wave. And no matter how many waves you've already ridden, every new wave will be a new exercise in Metis. So ultimately, Metis can be thought of as a style, a demeanor, and a set of predispositions. So again, Metis is not broken down into cardinal principles. It is embodied in a mindset, in a way in which we approach and engage with the world. It is, as Robert Cheer and Robin Holt put it, a cultivated art for reversing unfavorable or disorienting or even unrecognized situations into ones replete with potential that involves alertness, sensitivity, a peculiar disposition that is particularly attuned to emerging opportunities contained in unfolding circumstances. So of course, there's here a close connection with the idea of emergence, of complex adaptive systems, in which environments throw up unforeseen events, and in which the art of Metis is to turn that to your advantage, kind of mental jiu-jitsu of sorts. Now, all of this ultimately explains why Metis was never explicitly formulated, never the subject of a conceptual analysis or of any coherent theoretical examination. Because of everything that I've said to you, it's quite clear that it therefore becomes quite difficult to formulate Metis. One can only approach it indirectly rather than break it down into something that might be easily teachable and digestible. Detienne Vernon says, Metis always appears more or less below the surface, immersed as it were in practical operations, which, even when they use it, show no concern to make its nature explicit or to justify its procedures. The practice of metis does not strive towards the formulation of some universal knowledge, but merely the performance of that exercise. And so therefore, the forms of intelligence and knowledge that are produced are fleeting, transient, and to some degree not self-aware. Because that self-awareness would require an abstraction from the context in order to be intelligible and communicable. A key related notion here is the Greek word or idea of Kairos. Kairos refers to the right critical or opportune moment. That moment which might be the passing instant when an opening appears which must be driven through with force if success is to be achieved. It's about seizing the future into the present. So Kairos is this idea that efficacy and meaningful action requires the ability to know the moment, the precise moment at which action is required. Again, this is very closely attuned to metis. Scott tells us that knowing how and when to apply rules of thumb in a concrete situation is the essence of metis. And again, this is not something that's going to be digestible, translatable into fixed rules, because that moment of Kairos will be unique, specific to a moment, and to a place and moment, to an action that will have to be made. Now, in fact, of course, we can find with this idea of Kairos a number of related military notions through which various thinkers have tried to capture that notion of Kairos. We find it, of course, in Clausewitz, when Clausewitz talks about coup d'oeil and genius, coup d'oeil being the ability for the general or the man of genius to be able, in a single moment, to obtain a synoptic overview of the scene, to draw connections and inferences about what needs to be done, again, in a way that is not reducible to rules or to rational calculation. Genius, again, crucially for Clausewitz, is something that cannot be reduced to rules and to rote learning. Another notion is that of Fingerspitzengefühl, a notion promoted by Erwin Rommel, notably, which means in German, fingertips feeling. That tingling of the fingertips, that sense of what the moment requires, what action is demanded, what the environment, what the situation tells the commander that's attuned to those very minute distinctions, that very moment where action has to be taken. What the instinctive and immediate response to a battle situation might be. Now, all of this ability to reverse unfavorable situations, to turn the environment to one's advantage, to seize the fleeting moment, means that metis is particularly useful to overcome, let's say, the superior strength of an adversary in a contest. Metis is closely aligned, or a tool, form of intelligence that is privileged by the underdog. The use of asymmetric tactics is the realm of metis par excellence. Detienne and Vernon tell us that the metis is ultimately the absolute weapon, the only one that has the power to ensure victory and domination over the others, whatever the circumstances, whatever the conditions of a conflict. Now, of course, this is perhaps also one of the reasons why powerful, leading organizations, such as militaries, are not drawn naturally to metis, because they don't feel the strain, the urgency of relying on different forms of intelligence. It's easy for them to fall back on what they know, on what has worked, on what they know they're good at. But of course, that's not a luxury afforded to the underdog, who has to think creatively about how to respond, who has to think about what the enemy's strengths are and how those strengths could be maneuvered to their own advantage. One of the most common asymmetric responses, which is profoundly metic, is if the rules of the game don't suit you, if you're going to lose by those rules, then you change the rules. And that's what the powerful, of course, don't want, because the rules, they've set the rules, and the rules allow them to prevail. For all these reasons, metis is closely associated to a particular, how should we call it, particular mechanism or activity or set of operations. And that is, I'll let you complete this, it's a trap. It's a trap. Yes, the trap. The trap is quintessentially metic. Whether it's the net, the snare, the noose, the cage, the pit, the lure, the bait, the ambush, the entire duplicitous world of traps and devices falls under the ambit of metis. Now, crucially, traps require an understanding, or we might perhaps call a model, of the prey. Right? A trap is designed to catch a prey. And how do you catch the prey? You need to know the prey. You need to understand the prey. A trap will require a choice of bait, something that will draw the prey to the trap. It requires a choice over the placement of the trap. Where do you put the trap? What will attract the prey, and where will the prey find itself? And you can only know this by understanding the behavior, the habits, and the drives of the prey. If you don't understand the prey, you have no chance of building an effective trap. So to some extent, you have to become the prey in order to be the trap for it. Furthermore, you have to think about the actual design of the mechanism that is the prey. Because, of course, the trap is designed to entrap, to snare the prey, to overcome its strengths, so that once the prey is in the trap, they cannot escape it. In fact, the more cunning trap is one which might even turn the prey's forces against itself. Think of those snares and nets that tighten the more the prey struggles. One of the interesting consequences that flow from thinking about traps is that we realize that metis, and the Greeks were very aware of this, is a quality that we find distributed among living beings. Lots of animals lay traps. The whole predator-prey dynamic is one that is deeply embedded in metis, whether it's in the schemes and traps that the predator deploys to catch the prey, or the countermeasure that the prey uses in order to escape the predator, to delude it, to misguide it, and so on. So whereas traditional or other forms of intelligence are thought of being quintessentially humans, we are rational animals, we distinguish ourselves from the rest of the living species, actually metis is something that's on much more of a continuum, where it can be recognized and identified in other forms of living beings, as well as in ourselves. The Greeks in particular highlighted the octopus as the polymorphous master of disguise, and the fox, who displays, of course, particular cunning, including its propensity to turn back on its own tracks, to mislead prey and other predators. So, in this last part of my talk, I want to encourage you to think about the need for metis and cunning, not only in the wider context of war, but also within your institutions, in advancing design thinking. Because metis is something that can be applied and should be applied in every context. And your adversaries are not only on the battlefield, they may be also within your institutions. So let me suggest 3 possible stratagems. I draw 2 of these at least from Dan Hill's Dark Matter and Trojan Horses strategic design vocabulary. The first is the Maguffin. The MacGuffin is an object, an event, or a character in a film or story that serves to set and keep the plot in motion, despite actually lacking intrinsic importance. So there are many, many MacGuffins in different stories you can think of. The MacGuffin in Pulp Fiction is interesting because it very purposefully draws attention to itself, this suitcase with light emanating from it, the object that the various characters in the films are pursuing, that draws them together and so on. It moves the plot on, but ultimately we never find out what's in the suitcase, and in a sense it doesn't matter. That's not what the story was about, but the story wouldn't be able to happen without that MacGuffin. Now Dan Hill argues that a MacGuffin is something that can provide motivation to introduce change in an organization. In other words, by creating an objective that is not actually the objective, but really just a way in which to draw resources, people into a process of change, one for which there might not otherwise be the necessary motivation. Hill puts it, the problem is in taking clear design intent to development, procurement, and commissioning, and emerging from the other side with the intent intact, perhaps even improved by the process, such that further strategic outcomes can be realized. The MacGuffin helps drive this process through its gravitational pull, through its requirement for rigor. In sum, the MacGuffin is an object that can motivate all the various actors. It is the lure, the bait, if you want, that draws people to it. But the central objective is not the attainment of the MacGuffin, but the preservation of an ulterior design intent, the strengthening of the implantation of that intent in the organization, and the ability to fight another day. A second stratagem is, and we saw this yesterday, or there was a brief mention of it yesterday from Ben, which is the Trojan horse. The difference here between the Trojan horse and the MacGuffin is that the Trojan horse, or the MacGuffin, is a simple artifact that provides motivation, whereas the Trojan horse is an artifact that carries hidden strategic elements. So the Trojan horse might be the statement of a particular goal whose realization requires the achievement of secondary strategic outcomes. So the Trojan horse is a strategic outcome that's set out, but in fact, in order to attain the strategic outcome, along the way you have to realize other strategic outcomes, and those strategic outcomes were the actual goal. These are the things that you really wanted to achieve. The realization of the Trojan horse is incidental, ultimately. And the choice of the Trojan horse is entirely expedient. You don't say, this is what we really want to do because this is what you really want to do, or because you think it's the most important thing that you want to do, but you say you want to do this because by doing this you're going to do all the things that you really want to do. Finally, one might consider the so-called empty fort strategy. This is a ploy from ancient China. It's an episode drawn from an episode from the classic Romance of the Three Kingdoms, a 14th century novel on the breakup of the Han Dynasty around 220 BCE. And the ploy here is a general is occupying a fort, but this fort is totally undefended. There are no troops there. There's nothing they can do to hold it. And marching towards the fort is a powerful army. So the master strategist, Zhu Zhiliang, opens the city gates and sits in surrender on the battlements while his men sweep the road below. Upon seeing this, the invading general, who's well aware of Liang's reputation as a master strategist, thinks there must be some cunning plot here. This is a lure. This is a trap. They're pretending that this fort is undefended. When we step in, they're going to massacre us. So they flee. The principle here is to deceive the strategy into thinking that an undefended location is full of traps and ambushes, and therefore induce the enemy to retreat. In effect, it's an embodiment of the principle of reverse psychology. To convince your enemy that they want to do what you want them to do. And it's very important to see that there's a very strong emphasis on this kind of manipulation in Chinese strategic thought. That you want your adversary to embrace what they want, what you want them to do. You want to plant in their head the idea that is your own. And of course, in order to do this, again, you have to know your adversary. You have to know their predilections. You have to play to their vulnerabilities, to their cognitive biases, to their habits. Note that in the Chinese tradition, manipulation also extends to one's own troops. Sun Tzu advises the general to deceive the eyes and ears of his officers and men so nobody realizes what he is doing. So reverse psychology works again against your direct enemies, but also potentially upon those that do your work. So in sum, be more like the trap. That's it.
Is Metis a superior type of intelligence to technique?
Well, I don't think we should ask the question in those terms, because technique is very good at certain things. Technique, of course, has left with us the terminology of technology, and we can build very effective machines with technology, machines that rely on reproducible action, because we've been able to abstract through our intelligence certain universal principles. Gravity, the laws of gravitation, the laws of thermodynamics, they pretty much hold repeatedly wherever you try them out. So for certain forms of knowledge and for certain forms of action, technique is great. But technique fails when you're looking at contextual, situational environments which become highly unpredictable, which of course is what we expect when we're looking at nonlinear systems, complex systems. You cannot apply the same kind of rationality as you would to a closed system or to a system that has predictable types of behavior. So METIS is not inherently superior, although you could perhaps make the claim that METIS underpins basically all forms of intelligence. You could make the claim that technique is actually a subset of METIS, so maybe you could make that point. But I think for more practical intent, and METIS is ultimately all about practice, you judge METIS by its results, not by its method, METIS will be applicable to contexts which are suitable for it, and in those contexts, it will be an eminently superior form of intelligence.
They are cunning you into answering the planning design. What's the superior type of intelligence?
Or are they?
Planning or design?
Or maybe I'm laying a trap.
Thank you for a very enlightening talk. Because, of course, the Greek tradition also, Aristotle mentions phronesis, as the practical wisdom. So I see that METIS sort of comes into this equation,
Yes.
but it hasn't been sort of developed, as you say, because this is the one that you actually can't entangle. If you go to pedagogics, we talk about going to school as learning about doing, so that becomes the sort of the technical part of that type of knowledge. Then John Dewey came up with learning by doing. He said that the schools were too distant from reality, so the schools needed to bring reality into school, so we had to learn by doing. And I think that some of the examples that we had yesterday on the boards, that was sort of learning by doing. But then the situated learning idea that came up with Etienne and Wenger almost 20 years ago now, the community of practice, they started talking about learning in doing. And I think that that's a distinction in your talk that is actually very useful when we talk about design. Because the difference between learning by doing and learning in doing is that it's not learning by trying to do something, but it's actually learning when we're doing what we are supposed to do. And I think that the cunning part here is that it has to be not realistic, but it has to be real. You have to be in the situation, so that, as you said, it's an embodied experience. It's not something that it's like a footballer who's trying to learn a feint, and doing that. But you have to do it in the real life to actually understand how it works. Because every other situation actually becomes a reductionistic situation of the reality, and then it won't work. It's just a comment. I think it was very brilliantly put.
Thank you. Well, let me respond to a few things you say that I think are important. Yes, you're right. Aristotle talks about phronesis as a kind of practical knowledge. But I think the important distinction between the emphasis that Aristotle puts on phronesis and metis is that phronesis for Aristotle is always tied to kind of idea of the moral good.
Yeah.
So it has to serve the community, and this is the thing about metis, is that metis is kind of evil in a way, right? It's double, this is the ambivalence within the Greeks. That's why the Greeks felt uncomfortable with it, because they saw the power of it, but they also saw the problems and dangers of it. Of course, it's untethered from ideas of morality or the higher common good. So it is, of course, something, in a sense, that has its dangers, but then all powers have their dangers, you could say. So I think there's lots of ways in people have talked about forms of intelligence that overlap with metis, but what's often lacking in these alternative conceptions is that profound conception of cunning.
Yeah.
And where cunning, of course, comes in particularly is because it applies, not strictly, but especially in adversarial situations. And that's the problem with some of that's a limitation, let's put it this way, of some of the simulations and exercises that where we try to get people to think originally, is that there's not an adversarial relationship. You can do all the team building you want, but ultimately, especially if you're thinking in the context of war, which is the adversarial relationship par excellence, then you need to be thinking about what the adversary is thinking. You need to be adapting yourself to that most unpredictable, or maybe predictable, it depends, of variables. And also, therefore, there's a second order action here where you have to then anticipate what the adversary is thinking, what their metic processes are, what deceptions they might be trying to pull onto you. And of course, it's a whole of mirrors ultimately, which is again why you can't reduce it to principles, but to an intuition and a sense of what is proper for particular situations, which of course...
That's why you can't put it into a classroom, because in a classroom situation, the adversary won't do what they would do in real life, because it's not a real play.
Well, so first of all, you could do exercises where you use the adversarial relationship much more openly, where you force people to think in that mode. Now, of course, there's always you're right that any exercise is an abstraction, a simulation of a reality that can never be entirely replicated. But in many cases, that's the best we're going to get. Right? We're only going to ever simulate nuclear war because you can't really have a practice run at it. Just to take a particular dramatic example, but it applies. But
the easy example is boxing. So if you're training boxing,
yes,
when you're training for a title fight, you're on the top level of everything. Mm-hmm. But the sparring partner that you have, he's not there to hurt you. Right. So it's already ingrained in the situation, in the practice, that it's not real.
Yes. Sure.
And that's a simple example.
Yeah.
We have a question on the board, and then maybe David. So techno metis seem to offer explanatory basis for how we are failing in our professional military education systems. Do you think we can create curricula that get to the ideas of metis? It seems like we're more fixed on techno.
Well, potentially. I think there's no reason why you couldn't do so. I leave up to you educators to think about how you would do this in a classroom environment. But I would also encourage you to adopt metis in a broader conception. Don't think, metis is just what we do when we're doing the classroom. Metis is a way of being. Everything you do within your institutions has to be informed by metis, at least if you want to be true to it. And also, that's also what you want to impart, presumably, to your students. That metis is not just something that you perform in a particular context, but it's something that you imbibe and becomes a way of engaging with the world. So I think metis always demands that you force yourself to think outside of the frame that you're in, because again, that's precisely what the asymmetric response is in war. Is think beyond the frame. If there's a given frame, break that frame. Think what allows you to go beyond it, to change the rules that are along which a contest is being disputed.
In a sense, the notion with metis, one of the difficult decisions around calling this innovation methodologies that was discussed was that it's not really a methodology, it's a praxis, it's a way of being. Yes. So it's remembering that something's a way of being rather than like a demeanour, like you said, I think was one of the terms you used, rather than a method. So in a way, our whole title is wrong, but it's just difficult to know how to share that.
Yeah.
You know, when
Well, again, the
making
difficulty
claims.
is that you can't formalize it, you can't
Exactly.
teach it, you can only
Yeah.
get at it in an indirect fashion.
Yeah.
There's a very interesting book by François Julien called A Treatise on Efficacy, which is a book on Chinese thought, particularly notably on strategic thought, and he draws connections between Metis and Chinese thinking, which is very much based, again, on this form of anticipation,
Yeah.
contextualism, without resorting to fixed rules, without being fixated on the objective, but on the conditions of the environment, and the affordances. I think that's a very important term, affordances. What opportunities does the environment produce? Think of this like climbing a wall, and let's use the climbing metaphor. What's the grip? What's the next grip? What's going to allow you to move to the next position? And that's going to be different in every single wall that you climb.
Yeah.
And a good climber is not someone that can tell you, oh, this is how you climb. It's someone who intuitively knows in relation to their own body, because everybody will be also different, have different forms, different extension, different muscle densities and so on, how you will climb that wall.
And in a sense, that I think highlights the distinction between planning and design. Design is almost a way of being, and planning is a way of maybe doing. It's within a confined space, whereas design is a sort of a way of being, a demeanour, a way of moving forward. But David, did you have a question?
Sure.
Do you want the mic?
That's okay. Thank you, Doctor. I find it very similar with Metis, the Greek orientation, and kind of comparing that to the Chinese orientation on Cunning,
Yep.
based off Taoism. So I wonder if you ever read the book Deciphering Sunset by Derek Ewan. So he goes into kind of detail about sheer propensity, hastiness, formlessness, Chang Chi. Certainly John Boyd kind of looked at that in his matter of conflict. But from my understanding from the Chinese approach, it's kind of, with the Taoists, it's kind of baked into their DNA. And you said that the Greek with the Metis wasn't, it was kind of a dangerous or possibly problematic approach. So I thought that was kind of interesting, and the fact that Metis was not just something, an idea, but not necessarily kind of baked into the DNAs of the Greek. And my other point is, I think you can kind of train cunning through gaming, whether it be force on force or any other type of computer simulation game, that you might be able to do that.
Yep. I think there's another question I'll ask him.
I don't know that I necessarily need that.
Hi. So I would actually challenge you. I think that cunning, design thinking, and creativity actually can be taught. It can be fostered, but I think it's wholly dependent on the culture of the organization that you're in. And I think that militaries are very hostile to the concept of Metis because of the hierarchical structure. Now, it depends on what type of organization you are operating in. If special forces, I think, is a bit more flexible, but I think one of the challenges, and the challenge in this room that probably a lot of people have, whether they realize it or not, is the fact that hierarchical structures are very hostile to people who do not conform to the frame, or people who do. We require it of our people, but then we kind of push them down. So I think that that's a huge challenge when we talk about how do we teach this, and then how do we foster a culture that actually encourages that from a military context, because right now the adversaries that we face are incredibly good at this, and we are not.
There's another question in the back.
I'm also in the military, so I'm not fully disagreeing what you just said, because our adversaries also are highly hierarchically. So I might be interested to study them. So my question is more, is this a talent or is it a competence? Because then it's about talent management. I have to find the right people in my organization, or I can train the competence to make everyone a designer. Is this possible in your ideas?
Should we go for the last one then?
Walter, I know you can shout.
Yes, Anton, I have a question in your depiction of Metis. Is it an ontology, an epistemology, or a praxology?
Okay.
And that's all the questions we've got time for, if Anton's going to answer any of them.
Well, I mean, there's a set of questions about didacticism and how we teach it, and whether institutions are more open to it or not. Yeah, undoubtedly, some institutions are probably going to be more closed to it than others. I don't disagree with that. And I think there's going to be people that have more innate abilities for it than others. But ultimately, there's no reason to think it's something that can't be taught. Because it is a form of innate intelligence. In fact, the reality is we do metic things all the time, and we have to be aware of that. There's not a set of ideas, oh, there's a revelation. But you do metics all the time, and you're just not aware of it, precisely because it's so difficult to formalize. And if it's something that lives in the animal kingdom, I think all of us could probably qualify for the ability to perform metis. So I think it's something that can definitely be drawn out, and has to be drawn out, I think, by recognizing the places where other forms of knowledge production, other forms of action in the world are not going to be as efficient or are going to fail relative to the flexibility that something like Metis offers. But Metis is fraught with dangers, of course. You can fail with Metis probably in a very bad way as well. So it's not a silver bullet to any problem, but it's about thinking about problems in a different way. A big question at the end, about ontology, epistemology, is certainly a form of epistemology, but it probably underlying it is an ontology, a certain understanding about the nature of the world as something that is fluctuating, variable, unpredictable, that is a world of becoming and not a world of being. And you could say one of the reasons why the Greeks became uncomfortable with it is because it's being that predominated within the Greek tradition in the end. Your Plato's, your Aristotle's ultimately settled on being. We've got to identify the universals that underlie our reality. But if you go to Heraclitus or to other from the Greek tradition, you find a notion of becoming being much more central, which gets us back to the Chinese, who in Taoism are all about flow and becoming. But I would say the Chinese also, and it's true, of course, that might be more innate to their culture in some ways, but they grapple with some of the same problems in the sense that Confucianism is also about social harmony and would certainly enter into tension with some of the stratagems and traps that Chinese strategic thought might put forward. So these are ethical normative questions that we all have to grapple with. What are the limits of what's permissible in the name of efficacy? Clearly there are limits.